How did you learn about consent? I don't know that I learned about consent in a particularly formal way. Like, here is a class about consent. Now you learn it systematically. It came through like years of negotiation and experience, especially with having my first partner. And then later on, I got much more involved in things like sexual rights activism. And I think that gave me a much more explicit, thorough understanding of the different ways that consent manifests and all the discussions around consent.
It's not spoken about enough. It needs to be spoken about more. Learning about consent is important, and if you haven't been educated on what consent, is, it can be really hard to navigate.
What are the biggest misconceptions you've heard about sex and consent? I think there's sometimes conceptions that sex can only happen in certain ways. I, for a while, had vaginismus, which is a condition where, your vagina feels like a little too constricted to have any sort of penetration whatsoever. A lot of discussions of sexuality, even for queer femmes, didn't acknowledge that as a reality. But there's so many ways you can get sexual pleasure and it doesn't need to.
Probably the biggest myth around sex and consent that I've come across, your first time has to be really special, or it has to be someone that you have a deep emotional connection with. That might not seem relevant for a lot of people past 20, but as a lot of us disabled people know, we might not have sex for the first time till a lot later.
There's a lot of cis heteronormativity when it comes to discussions about sex. The assumption gets made that everyone's body works exactly the same way. And that's not true. Our bodies all work differently.
What are the biggest misconceptions you've come across about disability and relationships? I come at this having an extra layer of coming from a racialized background, where there's already assumptions about oh, you can't be disabled, you're brown, or for example, even when people want to know about my disability or my sexuality, my race often comes first.
Our disability defines us in the relationship, and it doesn't. For some, maybe a very big part of their life. For some, it may not, but I can't think of too many people that they would say disability is their only thing.
That disabled people are a burden because we might not be able to do certain types of housework or play certain kinds of roles in relationships, so that means it's not equal or that the other person is saving us. Relationships that have a disabled person in them doesn't need to just have one. Disabled relationships are really beautiful. I'm really tired of being seen as a disabled person in the light of non-disabled people.
What do you wish you've learned about consent when you were younger? I do wish there was just more about, in general, that yes, you have your own agency, including being able to say, hey, this doesn't work for me, and having that be respected.
I wish I'd learnt about it full stop. Growing up, I was actually told that my body didn't belong to me, it belonged to God, it belonged to whoever the man I married was going to be, it belonged to my parents. Yeah, wish I had known that I had the right to say no.
While we talk about consent a lot in terms of sex and intimacy and relationships, it's also not just that. Being a wheelchair user, sometimes people will come up behind me and just grab hold of the chair. No communication, no nothing. We are not for public consumption. Disabled people need to be aware of this as well, so that they can recognize that, hey, this thing wasn't okay. I'm allowed to be upset about that happening. What does asking for consent actually look like? What should I say? It's okay to not necessarily know what to say. Having a conversation about consent is to work out boundaries and to make clear what is potentially unknown.
Asking for consent can look like as diverse as any other communication. It can be verbally speaking, signing, typing, gesturing, whatever you like. As long as you make sure that communication is actually happening, that's the main thing you need to think about.
You can just ask some establishing questions. What are you interested in? What is it you want to do? Sometimes they won't even know what to say to that question because no one's ever asked. So just get, sometimes you start with just getting to know each other.
Just ask them, what does consent look like to you? What makes you comfortable? What doesn't make you comfortable? Is there anything I should keep in mind?
What you actually say, things along the lines of, can I, and then insert action here. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
What do I do if my understanding of consent and my partners aren't the same? Not because they're ignoring consent, just when they have different assumptions about how this all goes. Feel empowered to stop the situation. Like if you need to say stop, time out, hold up, when it feels safe and okay for you to do so, go for it.
Talk to each other. Have however long-winded of a conversation you need to have to make sure that you are both on the same page.
How do you start conversations about what you want or what they're interested in for a casual hookup when you've never met the person before? Try to understand your boundaries to begin with, and then coming in to the hookup knowing those boundaries. Do it with someone you trust, do it with someone you like.
When you're hooking up with someone, how do you ask if they've been tested for STIs? So know for yourself what your limits are in that situation. Are you okay if it's some level of it's been a while since they tested, or would you rather they go get tested straight away and talk to you?
You can start out by saying, hey, I get tested around every 3 months or something. Have you been tested recently?
So long as you are being kind about it and are asking in good faith, there are ways to work around it. If you have an STI or if your partner does, it's doable, and it's not something that anyone should be afraid of or ashamed of.
How do I talk about access needs and sex? Will it kill the mood? Probably, with the wrong person.
Sometimes the mood can get a little off because conversations like this are tricky and not always the most entertaining or sexy, but they're important. It's better to kind of kill the mood early on than it is to just barrel on in an unsafe situation and then the mood gets killed even worse down the line with regrets. In the conversation, when you're like checking each other's consents and wants and desires, and that would be a good time to talk about your access needs.
Like for me, I always, once I've planned to meet up with someone, I'll say things like, can you please make sure that if it's important communication that I can see your lips, or that, can we make sure we have the light on? I have Ehlers-Danlos loss, and so I need to make sure that my hips don't start to dislocate during sex. And so, like, if it's at my house, I will already have the cushions there so that I don't actually even need to ask them. I can just say, hey, I'm going to grab this cushion and put it behind my back.
Probably the simplest and easiest one to kind of work it into it being sexy and like still part of everything is to direct your partner. But also, it's okay if it kills the mood, if it's something that like really needs to be brought up.
Sometimes I feel like I have to do disability 101 with every new partner. Any advice for navigating that? That is a mood. How you feel about the 101 thing with any particular person could be a starting point for like, do I even want to continue? Just remember, you are not obligated to do the 101. It is not your job as a disabled person. You consent to it as much as you consent to a sexual encounter. The education is also something you get to have a consent and say over.
I think of it in the similar way how I think of my gender. A lot of the time I have to explain that in the same context. I've essentially just had to think about it of how much work do I want to do? Do I want to spend heaps of time explaining it so that they have a really deep understanding, or do I want to just get it to safe and comfortable enough?
I would recommend actually just finding a resource you like, a resource you feel explains what you're trying to convey, communicating that resource perhaps to them.
The easiest thing that pops to my mind is date another disabled person. That shouldn't have to be the fix. We shouldn't have to stick within our own community, but I like to remind people that that's a valid option.
Disability 101 is kind of gonna come up even with other disabled people. If you all have different disabilities and different access needs and all of that, it's still going to come up.
I know what I want and what I need to have a good time with someone else, but how do I actually tell them? Amazing that you already know what you want. That is often the first hurdle. Tell them, but also listen to what they have to say. A lot of times you can start by asking them what they're interested in.
Personally, I find it's good to actually write down a list of the kinds of things I like. It's a lifesaver.
In my experience, kind of the best way to do that is to just come out and say it, like be like, this is how we do this. This is what I need. This is what I want. Let's have a conversation on how to make this work. Most people do actually quite like that clear communication. It allows it to be a good and fun experience for everyone involved.